Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Integrity Matters by Turnitin. My name is Chooks, and today we're exploring the impact of the pandemic on research integrity practices and what it means to commercialize in this space. In the house with me today is Dr. Esther Gan, scientist, Nuevocor in Singapore. Hello, Esther, how are you going?
Hi, good morning, Chucks.
Good morning. I think our first question we'd like to get to know you. So, can you tell us a bit about your academic research and your professional background, and what excites you about the work you do at Nuevocor?
So first of all, thanks for inviting me. It's an opportunity to get to speak to you guys. So I actually had a very interesting route to where I am right now. I started as a PhD student at Duke US Medical School, but my interest in research actually stemmed from Australia when I was on an exchange program at the University of Melbourne, and we were doing a pathology course and looking at slides of tissue brains, looking at Alzheimer's actually. And that's where I really got interested in doing medical research. So when I came back to Singapore, I joined a lab that did infectious disease, tropical infectious disease, mainly studying dengue and Zika, yellow fever, flavivirus family. So after that, when I transitioned into my postdoc, that's when the pandemic hit. And I'm sure all of us know about COVID-19 now. You have to be living in a cave to not know about it.
This is true.
So we got a really exciting opportunity to collaborate with a company in the US that was linked up to with us actually by the Economic Development Board of Singapore, part of the government wing. And we managed to get onto a project to make the COVID-19 vaccine in collaboration with them. So also an mRNA vaccine, but they were doing something slightly different than the current Pfizer and Moderna vaccine. So theirs is a self-replicating mRNA vaccine that's currently in clinical trials. So I spent 2 years on that project and then got a surprise opportunity actually, from this company, a startup in Singapore that started up during the pandemic itself. So kudos
Wow.
to them. Yeah. And so they're now working on a gene therapy for dilated cardiomyopathy that's targeting a mutation in one of the genes that controls the contractile functions of a heart. So basically now I've taken my biology experience from academia, transitioned into a startup company to try to use a viral vector to treat a heart disease. So as you can tell, skills are rather transferable. And in science, you're not stuck to whatever you've been trained in and studied, but the skills you learn, you can transfer to other companies and other sources of research.
What an exciting journey you've had, and particularly interested in to know. That's not part of today's conversation, but I'll be keen to pick your brain up with regards to how you've navigated working throughout the pandemic, especially with all the vaccines and all of that. But today we're looking at research integrity practices and commercialization. So my first question would be around, how do you define research integrity, and why is this important to supporting all things commercialization?
So research integrity is a hard topic, right? Because what's the first thing that jumps out at you? It's a scientist's integrity. You don't falsify your data. You make sure that you do all the proper research before you start an experiment. You ensure you have all the controls. If you're unsure about something, you repeat it or you try different ways to make sure that whatever you're reporting is accurate. So that's the most obvious part of scientific integrity that anyone would think about, right? But as I thought about it, research integrity it doesn't just apply to the person doing the science. It applies to the the government agencies that is funding the science, on how they choose to fund the science and who they choose to fund, right? Are you funding the research that has the most potential, or are you funding the labs that are just the biggest and the safest bets to go on? Are you choosing the right people to make the assessments on who to fund? Because at the end of the day, without funding, academic labs are screwed basically, right? You Without money they can't do research, and research is exceptionally expensive.
Hmm.
You wouldn't believe the amount of money it takes to make a small tiny discovery, and the number of people it takes to be employed to make one small discovery, and the years it takes. So there's a significant investment in that has to come from the government and public funds. And so how do you choose to disperse that funds? Is also part of research integrity, I think. And then if you go on to the next phase of research is publication. If you do research and you don't get it out into the public, then what's the point of doing the research, right? You're just hiding it for yourself. So the integrity there actually I think lies honestly on the publishers. So I any scientist, any academic scientist out there is going to tell you the same thing. It's publish or perish, right?
Yeah.
So then the what's disturbing about publishing now is that everyone focuses on impact factor and how big the journal is, and that makes or breaks your next grant cycle and how you apply for money. And then now we're back to a cycle of going back to governments for money, right? So the bigger publishers have started to charge a lot of money when it comes to publishing. So I think a couple of weeks back there was an uproar on Twitter, and I like to follow the scientists on Twitter because they're very unfiltered in their thoughts on Twitter. So Nature Biotechnology and the Nature Publishing Group has come up with a number, and that's exorbitant. So if I were to ask you to guess how much it costs to publish a paper open access, what do you think would be the just a number?
Say 20,000.
Oh, to publish a paper online.
I don't have any idea, but I would say because you said it's exorbitant, I'm gonna play around with maybe 5 to 10,000.
It's about 12,000, I think, US dollars,
Wow.
or 10 to 12,000 US dollars to publish in one of the top journals. So if you think about it, you're taking public money to do research, but now you're gonna charge the public to read that research.
Mm.
So I think that's also where integrity also stems by, right? We have a responsibility to ensure that the science that we do, the good science that we do, gets to where the science needs to be, right? Which is where the public needs to know, other labs need to benefit from the work that you've done, so that we're not repeating work and repeating failures all around, right? So that's a waste of resources. So not wasting resources, I think, also falls part of integrity. So the word integrity it overarches so many things in science, so many things that are right and so many things that are wrong currently in science. So it's an interesting topic to go about.
Wow. I think you've covered some things that probably we're not even aware of when it comes to research, especially in the science field. Um, Curious to know what impact the pandemic has had on the integrity of research and how has this been managed from your experience?
So for me, and this is a personal view, I think the pandemic has done great for the open accessness of research, right? Sure, they drove the researchers really hard. I've never worked harder than in my life than during the pandemic. But especially if you worked on COVID itself. But they started all researchers started to put their work online, preprints. So what we call preprints before they've gone to a peer review and before they've gone to a journal. They put it online free for access for everyone to see. So you had data today, the world knows tomorrow, right? And for scientists like me that were trying to navigate through how do we test the vaccine, what works and what doesn't, you don't want to waste time figuring out something that someone has already figured out by waiting 5 months to publish the work, right? So when I go onto this open access this preprint website, I get to see it almost in real time what another lab is doing somewhere else in America, for
Mm.
example, or in or recently when the Omicron variant came out, South Africa was really fast in producing out their data. So I think in terms for the pandemic, that part of science and academia has come really strong, and people are starting to be aware that the faster data comes out from every lab, the more open access it is, the easier and the better science gets produced from everywhere around the world. Everybody benefits from this,
Mm.
except the publishers, maybe.
Yeah, of course, because it's open access. So I think
Yeah.
I think what it sounds like is there has been some positive that has come out of this, especially in the sciences in terms of availability of data and access to the data, which is one of the biggest things. I knew there was back in the day there'll be a long process of trying to get retrieve data and you have to apply and wait and all of that. But now that we've got the free access, that has made research process a bit easier. What about the commercialization aspect? What would you say the pandemic had? What has been the impact of the pandemic on the current strategies?
Actually, what the pandemic has done is just it hasn't changed much, I think, but it's made people very aware that the commercialization of research is important. So in science, academia and industry comes hand in hand. One cannot exist without the other, right?
True.
Industry can't do basic R&D because it costs too much money, and you have no focus. No one's going to invest in an idea that's not proven
Mm,
or an idea that doesn't have some data behind it. You're asking private ventures to pump in millions of dollars, right? So the academic labs that do basic research and do really discovery research, they are essential, an essential cog of this. So they will come up with the ideas, they will come up with the seed. So if you think about it, it's like farming. Academic labs plant that seed, right? But in order for that seed to grow, you're going to need resources that are beyond the academic labs. You need money. You need a very focused team to just work on one thing. 20 people working on one thing only. An academic lab can you can't really sustain an academic lab by doing that. So if you look at how the pandemic came in, the most I guess the easiest example to give would be the COVID vaccines, right? BioNTech farmed up, partnered up with Pfizer, and they got their stuff out really fast because Pfizer had a network, a global network. They had money, they had resources, they had hundreds of people that they could put on to doing regulatory processes, to trying to get FDA approval, to setting up clinical trial sites around the world to get volunteers
mm,
to do manufacturing. So all this takes partnership, it takes globalization, it takes a lot of money that a big pharmaceutical could do, right? But a small academic lab will not have the reach to do it. So if you think about it, had had we not had industry collaborations or the commercialization of all this, the vaccine could have taken a lot longer to come out into the market. So Novavax, which is the protein vaccine, one could have asked the question of, had they partnered up with someone like Merck, would they have been able to get their product out into the market faster? That's a question that maybe we ask, but on hindsight, no one will ever know, right? But so those are questions that, while we always say that industry is it's about making money and making our investors happy, but that's the route to getting something out to the market and into the hands of people, which is what the basic researchers want to do. You don't do research just for the sake of making a discovery. You do research so that it can impact the life of the person that walks alongside you on the street,
mm.
right? And unfortunately, the way to get there is through the commercialization of the research itself.
So you've been talking, and I think one of my key takeaways from your response to that is the need for partnerships and networks and the funding. We know how difficult it is to get funding for any form of research. But what it also sounds like is an opportunity like the pandemic also provided resources to help us get to the vaccine. I'm curious, post pandemic, will there be an increase in funding to support research commercialization, or are we going to just go back to normal? What are your thoughts?
Well, I wish I was in a position to make some decisions
Yeah.
about this. Um, I think so. Maybe I'll speak on the Singapore landscape. Even before the pandemic, the Singapore government was doing its best to try to support biotechnology. Um, 20 years ago, we built Biopolis, which is like a hub, a scientific hub with like 10 buildings to try to support research. We are now revamping our science park to try to induce more pharmaceuticals to come into Singapore, into doing manufacturing, into doing pharmaceutical research as well. So I think we were well on the way. We are trying.
Mhm.
What the pandemic has done is just it's made the public aware that this needs to happen, and that we're not wasting taxpayers' money by doing this. It's not something that's going to be immediately rewarding,
Mm.
So research takes a
Yeah.
long time, right? We can't do 5-year plans. It has to be 10, 20-year plans and you're gonna have to have patience and pump in resources to get something maybe out 10 years later. But that's gonna save lives and that's gonna hopefully prevent the next pandemic, right? So I think if anything, what the pandemic has done is we probably need better surveillance. And that's what the government's probably going to invest in, and they should invest in surveillance and also pre preparedness for future pandemics that are going to happen.
Mm.
The last thing we want is another COVID-19
Yeah. No.
halting the entire global economy into a standstill for 2 years, right? So I think that's what is going. The pandemic has impacted upon what decision making skills are gonna have to arise from the government. But I think especially in Singapore, they've been trying even before the pandemic. What the pandemic will do is probably raise the awareness of this and speed it up a little bit.
So you envision more surveillance after post pandemic, which means it's opened up the open up our minds as individuals for one, open up the government's maybe pockets so that they can actually sponsor research. Um, with your experience in academia and as well as um, in the startup sector, what are your suggested steps to enabling greater research commercialization?
Well, honestly, we're not set up for it, right? Labs that have made a discovery, they are left to their own devices to try to get industry partners to get investors fundings, or they have to spin off into a startup. This is between them and their own institute. There's no real government regulation or government system that can help you to, as you go into a portal, I've made a discovery. Now, could you hook me up to private venture capitalists and or get government aid into or support into commercializing something? Even the government agencies that help to do commercialization or research depend on private ventures in Singapore. So they have a private ventures arm in EDB, we have a private ventures arm in Temasek, which is our national in investing company. So basically, we're still very dependent on the individual labs going out to seek funding on their own or spinning off a startup like my current company did. They started from an academic lab. They made a discovery there. They patented that discovery. It took a long time,
Mhm.
but and then they spun off into a company and basically hired a biotech CEO that went out to get money.
Mm.
So they did Series A funding. They um they got people interested in their idea, and then and that's basically what happens, right? In every startup, and then you struggle for a little bit because money is tight. But you have a team of 20 people working on one thing that's trying to make one treatment for a disease.
Well, it still sounds very interesting, although it's an arduous task in terms of going from the academic lab to patenting and all of that stuff. So, would you say it's worth it?
Oh,
The,
absolutely. If it was, of course, if it's easier, it's better. No one's gonna say no to an easier path, right?
yeah.
Um, I I personally think that at the end of the day, every scientist wants to see their discovery affect someone, positively, not negatively, of course. You want to see a translational portion to your science. Having the ability to commercialize that research, while it sounds very greedy, actually it's putting that discovery into a person's hands, into into the public, and
Mm.
that's where you save lives,
Yeah.
right? So I think that's important. It's worth it. It's a lot of work, but everybody plays a different part, right? So I'm on the R&D side. I have the easier part of this role, which is doing the discovery science at the bench. There's there's a whole team of people in the startup. That's the main focus is to how do you sell the ideas that you have? How do you go and get people interested and get people convinced that what you are doing is worth it and worth investing in?
Mm. Mm.
Yeah, so there are very different arms of that, and the integrity that comes on both sides are different, right? The people who are selling the work has to be honest. They have to be realistic about their discovery as well. You can't go out and tell people that I've discovered the cure to cancer when really you've not,
Yeah.
right? Um, the people in the lab have to produce data that's reproducible, that is trustworthy. It's not something that just works in the dish, but can work in a human.
Mm,
So I think on both ends, a lot of different expertise come into commercializing anything. So it's not trivial. It's not, and it's definitely not easy.
mm.
So but it's something that I think it's very worthwhile doing.
So, we've been talking about commercialization of research, what research integrity looks like, and you've been talking from the Singapore Nuevocor and your academic and current startup experience. What would you say is the future of research? How do you see technologies, evolution, and involvement in the transformation of research practices?
Technology has come a far way. The same as how cars have come a far way. We used to have horses drive carts, and now we have self-driving cars.
Yeah.
It's it's exactly the same with technology. Sequencing used to take us. You could publish a paper based on sequencing in the dark ages long ago, but now sequencing comes up, and you click a button on a computer. Tomorrow, your sequences come back, right?
Mm,
And that's also someone commercializing. Someone set up a startup company to to provide these services, right? So that's also commercialization of research. But technology has come a long way. We can do a lot more things now than we could 10, 20 years ago.
mm,
No, I mean, let's not even say 10 years ago, right? But a lot of research is built upon other people's research.
mm,
So as technology grows, we learn more. Sometimes we debunk what we found 10, 20 years ago as we can delve further into a cell. So for example, now instead of doing population sequencing of a bunch of cells, like 10 million, averaging it out, we can now do single cell sequencing. We can tell you what's happening on a single cell level of your reaction to a drug, a vaccine, or a mutation in your cell. So in the longer term, you're gonna get personalized therapy. You're gonna get machines that are gonna be able to do a lot more things than we are able to do now. And the faster technology advances, the faster science will advance as well.
wow. So you're very optimistic about how things are moving and how technology is going to support research practices. So that's a good thing. So, want to say a big thank you for everything you've the insights you shared as part of today's conversation. But just for us to wrap up, what would you say? And this is basically from your experience moving from academia to a startup. What would you say are some strategies that institutions in this case, I would lean towards the universities and institutions that are focused on research can take into consideration when looking to commercialize their research.
Commercialization of research actually is difficult because it's very different from doing academic research. In academia, you would find something interesting and chase after it, right? It doesn't necessarily have a very particular end goal in mind, which is I want to prove that this works, right? But they make basic discoveries, and that's how discoveries happen when you see something interesting and you chase after it. So I think for strategies that institutions can take is maybe you they could have seminars, tutorials, webinars, or to teach scientists what it looks like when you have something that's commercializable, when something is not, and when it is commercializable, what do you do? So a lot of scientists won't know where to go to file patents, or even if to even ask someone, "Hey, is this something that could go in the industry or could be commercializable?" So I think that's something that maybe has to be taught, because the academic training, the PhD training, teaches you how to do science. It doesn't teach you how to do business, right? And it doesn't teach you to recognize when a business opportunity comes, and to recognize when something can go into like a startup company or spin off into a startup company. Very few bosses and very few researchers out there are aware that this is possible. Oh, no, wait, maybe they are aware that it's possible, but the infrastructure is not easy for them to go along that path. So many might not take it. So for developed nations like Australia, Singapore, the US, you have hubs that can do this very easily, right? Like in Boston, they have an entire infrastructure of academia providing facilities for startups. They work in collaboration. Startups need to use academic facilities. That's just part of parcel of the game. So the if you live in these hubs, you are more likely to think, can my idea now go further? Right?
Mm.
Can my discovery go further? But if you're in an area that is not so set up for this or that has no awareness of this, you're less likely to think that my idea can go into the clinic or can be commercialized. So I think what is important is education. We at the level of doing your PhD, you should be taught how to recognize these opportunities and what to do when you recognize these opportunities.
Wow. So it's all about education. Everyone, maybe maybe universities and institutions need to start rethinking curriculum to include the business sense of finding that opportunity that you can commercialize and working with startups and thinking about the patents and all of that stuff. So I think you've shared some really insightful and I'll say from experience, you've been able to talk from experience, help us uncover this topic, which is exploring the impact of the pandemic and research integrity practices and commercialization. I'd like to say a big thank you. Um, and from the audience who's probably watching this, we'd like to say thank you, Dr. Esther Gan, for your time today and for sharing all your insights in today's episode.
Thank you for having me. This was fun.